Chapter 8. Volcanoes, thought Scylla. Volcanoes. That was what she had been told to expect when they landed on the planet Crevo. The Sith had fulfilled their promise to send her to exotic places off-world, and in the past 5 years, she had seen barren rock, forests covered in snow, and even a mining colony floating in the atmosphere of a gas giant. But she had never seen volcanoes. She tried to imagine the mountains of Yostin, but with the slopes bereft of shrubs and tumbleweeds, the rocky soil burnt black, and the gullies filled with lava. The image did not come together. Finally, the shuttle descended and slowed to land. Neither she nor the dozen Sith troopers with her had complained about the cramped, miserable cabin they'd all been shut into, but she could sense that they shared her anxiety to get out. As the ship eased down and sank on its suspension, she patted her belt to make sure that the gas mask she'd bought was still there. She stood up to be the first to disembark. The idea was that they would deploy someplace several clicks away from a Republic secret facility, approach on foot, storm the compound, and then slice into the mainframe computer. They would download sensitive information, exactly what information Scylla did not know, and then leave. That meant no danger should be waiting for them when they first stepped out of the shuttle, but Scylla knew that the vagaries of luck had no sympathy for plans, and in case something dangerous was out there, she did not intend to lose any of her troopers. She felt nothing for them. They were nothing more than disposable force-blind thugs who hid their fear and inadequacy behind their chrome armor and their black faceplates. But she knew Nahlis and Darth Umber watched closely to see how many of them she brought back alive, and she wanted to impress them. The door locks rattled open, and light flooded her eyes. The first thing she felt was a smothering, cloying, leaden heat. Moisture washed over her face. She heard whispering and hissing and singing and rustling layered over each other so thickly that she could not pick out where any one of the sounds came from. And she sensed life everywhere. Finally, her eyes adjusted to the light, and she saw a wall of green. Moss, mushrooms, and ferns flourished from the ground so that they completely hid the soil underneath. Slim, bent trees rose above the brush, studded with flowers and vines and growths that looked like fungus. Insects the size of her fist fluttered between the trees and hung upside down on moss-draped branches, and when she moved to step over a vine, it shuddered and slithered away. In the denseness of the greenery, there were no openings in the canopy through which to see the sky, but the shuttle had set down in a clearing, and through that, Scylla could see blooming puffs of white clouds against a blue-black sky. A great, long-winged reptile circled lazily and cracked open a toothy beak to let out a warbling, piercing cry. "Jungle," she said blankly. She'd seen pictures of jungles. She'd even walked through a jungle terrarium on a visit to Picton's Landing as a small child. But none of it compared to this. The jungle swallowed up everything, and extended as far as she could see in any direction, which admittedly wasn't far. For all she knew, it covered the whole planet. Without her homing beacon, she could have gotten lost here by walking 30 paces. "I was told to expect volcanoes," she said. "There are," said the sergeant of her squad. "There are 6 active volcanoes on this continent alone." "But it isn't volcano." She fondled the leaves that spread from the hanging vine, feeling the cool, clean dew wipe off on her hands and absorb into her skin. She looked back, and the troopers traded looks. Even through their opaque helmets, it was clear that they thought it should have been obvious that they would operate in jungle. She could feel their contempt like a burning rash. It demanded a response, a show of dominance to put them back in their place. She shrugged out of her cloak, folded it up, and handed it to the sergeant. When he did not take it, She draped it over his shoulder. "Put that on the ship." His hands did not move. "What are you doing?" "It's hot out here. I'm dressing for the weather." "And," she thought, "reminding you who you serve." "Now, where is the navigator?" With a soft clinking of metal on metal, a little droid ambled out of the shuttle bay. Six-legged, knee-high, and with a disc-shaped head covered in little flickering red eyes, it emerged into the sunlight and stopped, as if it too was stymied by the noise and density of the jungle. Scylla held out her forearm the way she had seen bird trainers do. "Come up here, droid. We need you to slice the Republic database." Spider-like, the droid crawled up her right leg, hooked one of its limbs over her belt, and finally climbed up onto her outstretched arm. It hung beneath it, its 6 legs interwoven and wrapped over her forearm. "Try again," she said. "If you hang there, you're going to fall off." The droid's head turned, stopped, and turned back in a patternless shuffle as it strained its simple mind to the limit. Then it inched up her arm to her right shoulder, hooked a leg over her opposite shoulder, and wrapped the other 4 legs around her waist. The legs squeezed a little, and the droid pressed its body snugly against her back. Scylla flexed her arms a little to see if the droid would fall off. It didn't. "Better," she said. "Now, to find that base." On Yostin, that would have meant a long, quiet walk down a dirt path with nothing to do but listen to the howling wind and watch your shadow change. Here, it was hard to focus on anything but the jungle. Every step required thought, and a few times she slipped on moss or got a foot caught underneath a root. "Commander! Hostile! To your right!" It took a moment before that made sense to her. To be called commander was still strange to her, and her instinctive reaction was not to look to her right, but to turn and face the trooper who had said that. That was as far as she got before an overwhelming force piled into her and knocked her flat against the muddy ground. For a moment, she forgot where she was, then found herself flinching away from great, thick, furry hands batting at her face and chest. One hand gripped her right upper arm, the little finger flush with her elbow, while the thumb butted against her shoulder, and with a mangling pain, the hand lifted her off the ground. Twisting her body, she brought her right hip to her left hand, snatched her lightsaber, and flailed it in front of her. The hand released her, and she dropped to the ground to get her first look at the owner of that hand. A humanoid figure stood 9 feet tall and covered in thick, green and white fur that clumped together into tufts that resembled spines. A brutish parody of a human face leered at her from behind tusks, and it waved its 4 arms, 3 now, in front of it. The Sith troopers opened fire, and blaster bolts stung the creature's back. It moved as if to turn its hefty body around, but Scylla did not give it the chance. She surged forward and sliced into its chest with a perfectly executed rising diagonal strike. She fell back into defensive stance while the beast froze, gurgled painfully, and tumbled to the ground. The rush of battle faded, and a dull, bruising pain coiled around Scylla's right arm. She rolled the shoulder a few times, found nothing broken, and reassured herself that the droid remained on her back. It clung to her with terrified strength. "Commander, are you hurt?" asked the sergeant. Scylla looked down at the mauled, furry body. Once again, a threat had underestimated her and paid the price. She grinned and kicked it. "Yeah, but you should see the other guy. Let's keep moving." By now, she found that she knew the tricks to walking over jungle terrain, and she was able to relax a little as they marched. Soon it became downright pleasant, in spite of the pain in her arm. Pulling a hair tie from her pocket, she gathered her hair into a short, high ponytail to let the sweaty skin around her neck feel the air. "Close to base," said a scratchy little voice behind Scylla. She startled, then realized it was the droid. Hoping the troopers hadn't seen her twitch, she said, "How close are we? Be precise." 0.5347 clicks. Margin of error 0.12. Margin is 0.12, and yet you felt the need to waste my time with that many decimal places? The droid said nothing for a minute, then imitated her own voice. Be precise. Scylla thought about that number. On Yostin, half a click away meant you were practically there, but when Scylla scanned the jungle in front of her, she saw nothing. Troopers, wait here. I will scout ahead and see what we're up against. We can surround the base, the sergeant volunteered, and conduct surveillance on all points and alert you if anything happens. Dressed like that? She looked at their reflective armor. They would see you before you saw them. And she was off. The droid had been correct. The Republic compound was only a short walk farther. But what it hadn't mentioned was that the compound was barely more than a large house. 3 stories tall, but with a footprint barely bigger than the house she'd grown up in. It was a boxy white Duracrete tower that hugged a rocky cliffside for the first 2 levels and split away from it at the 3rd. There were no windows, and there was only one door she could see, and aside from an antenna that pierced up from the top of the 3rd floor, nothing marked its aggressively bright white surface. Except for the vines that draped over the walls, of course. Those vines covered everything. Her eyes told her that there were no security cameras anywhere, and her force sense told her there were no living guards either. It puzzled her. Perhaps, for once, luck was on her side. In the shade of the cliff where the tower sat, the brush was lower, paler, and more tangled. Water pooled on the downhill side, with stalks and gnarled stems poking up from the smooth, glassy surface. The low vegetation gave her little chance to hide, but here in the shade, her dark clothes camouflaged her well enough, smeared as they were with mud and leaves from the fight. By keeping her feet under the water and moving them slowly, she kept her footfalls completely silent. The side of the tower was no more fortified than the front. Instead of cameras or guard-manned balconies, Scylla found a chute in the wall. Another entrance. An idea struck her, and she guided her eyes to the top floor of the tower. There, too, a door led into the roof of the top story. The slime under her feet gave way to solid ground, and soon she was within arm's length of the base of the tower. The 2nd story was much bigger than the 3rd, but it was also a little smaller than the 1st. There was a ledge, barely big enough to stand on, about twice as far up as she was tall. Scylla coiled. She called on the force, felt energy course through the bones and sinews of her legs, and she leapt. The force propelled her up past the ledge, but not much farther, just as she'd hoped, and she alit on the Duracrete surface without a sound. Her palms on the wall, she huffed out a sigh of relief, looked up, and gathered herself to do it again. Another leap. Her toes caught the next ledge, and with an undignified wobble, she made it to the top. She closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and did nothing. "Contact, Sergeant!" squeaked the droid. "Shush!" She slapped its metal hide. "Do you want the Republic to blast us both? Do that again and I will destroy you myself." It adjusted its grip on her waist, a spine-tinglingly unpleasant sensation. "Contact, Sergeant," it said again. She drew her lightsaber, thumb hovering over the ignition button. "Do you think I'm joking? I have put up with enough dim droids for one lifetime already. Do not test my patience." She calmed a little. "No, I do not want to contact the sergeant. I need to focus." Fortunately for the droid, it gave no further disruption as Scylla let go of her senses and filled her mind with the Force. She felt life underneath her feet. Life forces, oblivious, absorbed in what they were doing, and even some asleep, all so vulnerable that they were practically crying out for her to end them. And none were climbing the stairs to the top floor. She tried the door. To her surprise, the door opened with the touch of a button, smooth and silent. Inside, harsh industrial lights threw pools of bright white onto the floors and walls, but the light was not diffuse, so almost everything was in shadow. She skirted around the first pool of light to find a ladder, she had assumed there would be stairs, down to the second floor. As she peered down the ladder, she saw one of her prey walk below her. But he did not look like prey. He stood up straight, walked with purpose, and wore a clean, pressed uniform that marked him as belonging to the Republic Intelligence Service. If Scylla were to attack him, she thought, he would put up a fight, and she admired that. Earlier, she had imagined that she would have to massacre the staff in order to get the information she wanted. Now she found she didn't like that idea. She could have merrily cut through the ignorant rubes from Yostin as she had on the day she'd inherited her lightsaber and disposed of Lowdown, and she did not mind the thought of pushing her blade through the chest of that arrogant sheriff who had first arrested her. Or, of course, the bank robbers, although she hated them less. They, at least, had not insulted her. But military people like the one below had never once wronged her. What was more, they practiced discipline, strength, and the ability to look someone in the eye and end them if necessary. Those were virtues the Sith recognized. She smirked at her own line of thought. Ever since she'd been a child sitting in the schoolhouse, she'd been taught that the Republic Army was a band of dashing heroes who saved the galaxy from evil. Everyone on Yostin believed it, and many of them had signed up to join the war a generation ago, even though that war had never gotten anywhere near Yostin. Other Yostinites practically worshipped veterans, and Scylla distinctly remembered 2 children in the schoolhouse yard who would say, "My dad was in the war!" and instantly have the respect of everyone, including her. That teaching, Scylla supposed, had never completely washed off of her, not even now that she was a Sith and they were her sworn enemies, but still she felt it. So, she set a challenge for herself. The man passed under her unaware. She peeked down at the second floor and saw dark, bleak little offices lining the walls, each office nearly its own room except for lack of a door. A few housed people poking at computers, but all of them wore headphones, blind and deaf. Easing herself down the ladder, she looked around. None of these office computers was the mainframe. All were too small, but they must have been connected to it, so it could not have been far. She walked off in the direction of the man she had observed earlier and peered around a corner to find him bent over an open container that weirdly reminded Scylla of an ice cream chest. The man took out a strange-looking wire and clapped the chest shut, and immediately she knew he was about to turn around. She hustled away. Back in the room with the offices, she had 2 options to avoid detection: go up the ladder, or leave the room through the other exit, even though she did not know what was there. Her force sense told her there was life down there, but how vigilant it was she could not tell. Another option came to her, and she took it. She slipped into an unoccupied office, eased into the chair, grabbed up the headphones that lay on the desk, and pulled them on. The disguise was far from perfect. The droid clinging to her back forced her to sit unnaturally far forward. Her chin was barely a foot up from the desk, and her eyes were level with the bottom edge of the display. But she could not find the controls to adjust the chair, so there was nothing to do except hope the man didn't notice her as he walked by. He walked by, and no hand touched Scylla's shoulder. No tremor of suspicion or surprise registered through the force. She had gotten away with it. Scylla gave it time, then stood up to follow the man. As she descended another flight of stairs, she heard running water echoing off the bare Duracrete. Around the corner, the man stood at a sink that jutted crudely out of the wall, rinsing crumbs off a metal plate. He dumped it, along with a few utensils, into what Scylla figured was a wash basin. Then he plopped himself down on a cot on the edge of the room, where the light from a single overhead bulb barely reached, and he was visible only as a silhouette. "How's the adapter working for you?" he asked, across the room. Scylla followed his gaze to a short humanoid who seemed to be fiddling with a dead droid. It said. "Better. Just to be sure, I want to cannibalize the water sprayer. That installation can reduce the risk of electrical fire by 70%. The man shook his head. "That's expensive. We need an alternative. If the droid ever catches on fire, can it use the fire extinguisher on itself? How fast is its reaction time? If you don't know, none of us do. Get it operational. We'll test it and find out. Yes, sir. The two quieted down, but to Scylla's disappointment, they did not lie down to sleep as she had thought they might. The mechanic kept laboring over the droid carcass, and the human man started doing push-ups. There would be no sneaking past them. Unless... She noticed a wire running along the wall where it met the ceiling. Peeling the droid off her back, she held it up to the wire and whispered, "Cut it." The droid flicked out a little laser, and with a subtle whistling sound, it passed a bright red beam through the wire. The light in the downstairs room flickered out, leaving the human man and the mechanic in total darkness. "Blast! Not again!" The man grunted the way men do when they stand up. "I'll find the flashlight." While he grumbled, Scylla eased down the stairs and through the room unnoticed, holding the droid covered in her hands. The next corner was a three-way intersection. Down one exit was an expanse of darkness, probably a storage room. Down the other she saw her prize, a waist-high console that sat on a pyramid of computer parts, bristling with wires and switches and logic cylinders. Green metal foil covered the walls, which Scylla thought was probably protection against something, but did not care to wonder what. But unfortunately, the room was not empty. Beside the console sat a reptilian being with his tablet plugged into the computer, watching the screen as if for vital signs. Scylla's miniature blackout had attracted attention and stirred the staff. Time was now short. Crouching in the entrance to the storage room, she focused on the reptilian, moved her hand in an arc, and mumbled, "You are hungry and need to eat." The reptilian hissed thoughtfully, "I am hungry and need to eat." So he pulled a strip of dried meat from a pocket in his pants and began gnawing on it. Silently, Scylla cursed him, then tried again. "The light in the kitchen went out, and you need to fix it." That did it. "The light in the kitchen went out, and I need to fix it." He marched out of the mainframe room and turned to the kitchen without glancing aside to notice the interloper hiding in the shadows 3 feet away from him. She crept into the mainframe room and set her droid on the console. "You know what to do," she told it. Its legs tapped loudly on the hollow metal shell as it scurried to the interface jack, but then it connected and went still. For a short time, Scylla had nothing to do but sit and listen for activity outside. Soon, the droid disconnected. It faced her and looked like it was about to say something, but then it tipped its head down. "Be silent," she reminded it, "but show me what you have found. I must know what we came here to learn." The older Sith would probably never tell her, and if she looked at it in front of her troopers, they would no doubt report her snooping. But this droid could keep a secret. Probably it would forget it had ever shown it to her. The droid projected a holomap marked with red and yellow dots, and Scylla was lost until she saw text scrolling by, explaining that those dots showed suspicious activity hotspots representing crime lords, rebel cells, and, of course, potential Sith activity. Yostin was a blue dot. As far as Republic intelligence was concerned, that planet was beneath their notice. It filled Scylla with anger. It was illogical, she knew. She should have celebrated knowing that the Sith remained hidden. But she wanted infamy. She wanted fear. She wanted to see Yostin as a flashing red dot demanding attention, and she wanted to be part of the fleet that the whole galaxy watched with dread. She grabbed the droid. "Come on, we're leaving." Nobody noticed her flit from the mainframe chamber into the dark storage room, and in that room, there was no one except a mechanic arranging a few metal trinkets on a shelf, his work lit only by a bright white headlamp. With a simple trick of the Force, Scylla compelled him to take a sudden interest in the farthest corner of the room, and neither he nor anyone else noticed her accessing the front door, slipping out, and then closing it behind her. She blinked in the abrupt midday sunlight, but even as she struggled to regain her vision, her feet were already carrying her off into the obscurity of the jungle. and she congratulated herself on completing the challenge she had set for herself. She, all on her own, had entered the Republic compound, copied the data, and left without taking a single life.